He had buried her 10 years ago. There was no grave, no marker, no preacher to say her name. He just packed her memory down deep, into the hollow space between his ribs, and let the years pile on top like heavy stones. He figured if he waited long enough, the weight would crush the memory of her into dust. But it never did. She was still there, in the sigh of the pines at sunset, in the bitter first sip of coffee in the morning, in the dull ache that settled behind his eyes whenever a storm brewed over the mountains. He was a man with a pulse, but no life, a body moving through the motions. He tended his cattle, he mended his fences. He only spoke when a job couldn't get done without a word. Down in the valley, they had a name for him, the ghost on the ridge. A cowboy who'd lost his tongue. They were wrong. He hadn't forgotten a thing. He remembered too much. On the nights the wind howled and the coyotes sang their lonely songs, he'd sit by the fire and try to find her face in the smoke. For a moment, she'd be there. The fire would catch the curve of her cheekbone, light a spark in her eyes, that same fierce light that used to look right through him, into the very soul of him. Then the smoke would break apart, and she'd be gone, leaving him with nothing but dying embers. He told himself the same lie every single night. Love is a wound. Give it enough miles, enough time, and a man can walk it off. But that lie was getting heavier than the truth, and it was starting to bend his back. Her leaving hadn't been a choice. It was a theft. Her people had come and torn her away from him, their voices hard and cold as iron. She belonged to them, they'd said, bound by blood, by their laws, by things that were older and stronger than love. He'd just stood there, a statue of a man, completely powerless, and watched her disappear in a cloud of dust kicked up by their horses. He remembered she turned back, just once. Her eyes were wide, her mouth was open like she was trying to scream his name, but no sound came out. That was the picture he carried. That was the knife he kept sharp for 10 long years. He told himself she'd moved on, found a new life. He told himself her memory of him had probably faded to nothing. He told himself these things so many times, he almost believed them. The storm that night started as a whisper, the kind of wind that makes the pine needles tremble just before the sky rips open. He didn't bother with a lamp. He preferred the dark. But when the first crack of thunder split the sky, something inside him stirred. Rain hammered the roof of the old cabin, a relentless drumming that seemed to shake the very logs. He threw another piece of wood on the fire, feeling its warmth push back against the cold. The wind clawed at the shutters, begging to get in. He thought, how fitting. His heart had been shuttered for a decade, and now the storm was here, knocking. And then came a different knock. It was softer than the thunder, quieter than the rain, but it cut through the noise like a razor. He froze. His hand was halfway to the fire iron. Nobody came up to his ridge. Nobody. His ranch hand knew better, stayed down in the valley. The preacher had given up on him years ago. He hadn't had a visitor at his door in a decade. The knock came again, faint, frail, almost swallowed by the storm. His heart started pounding a rhythm against his ribs that matched the rain on the roof. He stood up, his body stiff, and unlatched the heavy wooden door. And there she was. Or a version of her, a ghost of her. A woman hunched against the wind, her hair, now gray, plastered to her face by the rain. A heavy shawl, soaked through, clung to her thin shoulders. Her face was a mask of shadows and lines, etched with a grief so deep it looked like it had been carved into her skin. He blinked, sure he was seeing things. She had to be a stranger, some lost traveler, a widow from a nearby town seeking shelter from the storm. He opened his mouth to ask her name, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was a desert, so he just stepped aside and let her in. She moved past him like a wounded bird, all fragile bones and wet cloth. She didn't look at him. She went straight to the fire and held her hands out to the flames, steam starting to rise from her shawl. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the storm outside. He just watched her, the way he watched the fire every night, waiting for a pattern to emerge, waiting for it to make sense. Her face looked like it was carved from old stone, weathered far beyond her years. And then she spoke his name. She didn't say it like a stranger, testing the sound of it. She said it like someone who had carried it on their tongue across deserts and winters, across 10 years of an empty world. The sound of it shattered him. His knees went weak, like the cabin floor had turned to mud. He whispered her name back. A question, a prayer. Terrified that speaking it aloud would break the spell, and she would vanish. She lifted her face then, and the firelight caught in her eyes. And in that flickering light, he saw it. This wasn't the slow ruin of time. This was the work of something violent. Her hair was white, yes, but not from age. It looked like the color had been ripped out of it by pure sorrow, by a hardship he couldn't even imagine. Her eyes, though tired, held the same fire, the same soul. She wasn't old. She was a woman of 40, a woman who'd had the years stolen from her. But she wasn't destroyed. His heart tripped over itself. Grief and hope crashed together inside his chest with so much force he nearly choked. She didn't say anything else for a long time. She just sat there, warming her hands, letting the silence stretch. Then, her voice barely a whisper, she started to speak. She told him about the tribe's law, the duty she was bound to, the endless gray days where she lived a life that wasn't hers, a life without choice. Every season, she said, carved another line into her face. Every year stole a little more color from her hair. She told him she had carried the memory of him like a sharp stone pressed against her heart, heavy enough to crack her ribs, but she never, ever let it go. She'd been afraid to come, terrified he would see her like this and turn her away, that his 10 years of silence weren't from grief, but from hatred. But the storm inside her had become bigger than the storm outside, and it had finally driven her back up his ridge, daring to hope. He listened. His throat was tight. His hands were clenched into fists. Every word she spoke was like a key turning a rusted lock deep inside him, opening doors to rooms he thought were sealed forever. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks into the air, lighting her face in gold. He could feel the weight of 10 years not disappearing, but shifting, becoming something he could maybe carry. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her close and prove she was real, but he was paralyzed by fear. What if he touched her and she dissolved into smoke, just another dream conjured by the storm and a lonely heart? Then her hand lifted. It was slow, trembling, and it reached across the small space between them. The air in the cabin seemed to crackle with energy. Her fingers hovered just over his, so close he could feel the heat coming off them, but not her touch. His heart was a drum against his ribs. The wind outside howled, rattling the shutters, screaming at the roof. But inside the cabin, time had stopped. If he moved, if he even breathed, the whole world might fall apart. So he sat there, frozen, her hand poised just above his, the firelight dancing in the space between them. And he had no idea if this was a reunion or if it was a reckoning. Morning came soft and gray, with mist rising from the wet earth like the ghost of the storm. Inside the cabin, the fire was down to glowing embers. They sat across from each other, still and silent, like two statues waiting for the world to begin again. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything unsaid, a presence so heavy neither of them dared to break it. Finally, her voice cut through the quiet. It was slow, careful, like someone learning to speak again after a lifetime of being silenced. She spoke of the years that had been stolen, how the tribe had forced her into a life of service, a life of children born and then buried, a life of duty that sucked the life out of her until the sorrow in her hair shone brighter than any silver of old age. She hadn't been living. She'd been an echo. The memory of his touch, she whispered, was the only thing that had ever made her feel real. Her story didn't come out all at once. It came in broken pieces, sharp fragments she let fall into the air between them. He gathered up every single one, and they felt like shards of glass in his heart, cutting him with every memory. But he didn't look away. He couldn't. When her voice finally broke, when she couldn't speak anymore, he found his own. He told her how he'd tried to bury her memory in hard labor, how every fence post he hammered into the ground was a nail in the coffin of his past, how every long ride was a prayer to forget. But every night she came back. He'd hear her laugh in the call of a coyote. He'd see her shadow move along the ridgeline in the moonlight. He admitted his greatest fear wasn't loneliness. It was that one day he would forget the exact color of her eyes, the sound of her voice, that his memory would become a story he told himself, not the truth. But now, seeing her here, he knew. His heart hadn't been lying. It had kept her safe, kept her real, even when his mind had tried to let her go. Her eyes softened. Tears welled up, but they didn't fall. She looked around the small cabin at the rough table he'd built, the worn-out quilt on his cot, the saddle gear hanging by the door. She said she had pictured this room every single night for 10 years, but never, not once, did she truly believe she would ever see it again. He wanted to tell her she'd never left, that she was in every log of the walls, in every breath he took in this place. But the words were too big, too heavy for his rusted voice. Instead, he just got up, poured hot coffee into 2 tin cups, and placed one in front of her. Her hands shook as she wrapped them around the warm cup. The hours passed like a slow-moving river. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. Every small movement was a conversation. She found a torn shirt of his and, without a word, picked up his sewing kit and began to mend it. He took her damp shawl and hung it carefully by the fire to dry. Their separate silences started to weave together, becoming a shared quiet, a rhythm that was both ancient and brand new. At one point, she smiled. A small, fragile thing. She remembered a time he'd tried to sing to her down by the creek, his voice all cracked and rough. A laugh escaped his throat, a sound so unfamiliar it startled him. She laughed too, a soft sound that seemed to stitch the broken pieces of the world back together. For the first time in a decade, the cabin didn't feel like a cage. It felt like home, but a new shadow was creeping in. She confessed the real reason she had been so afraid to return. It wasn't just that he might have moved on. She had been terrified that she would arrive and find him hardened beyond repair, a man made of stone, and that his rejection would be the final blow that shattered her spirit for good. He looked at her then, really looked at her, at the impossible courage it must have taken to climb this ridge, to face him after everything. He knew he couldn't let her carry that fear for one more second. His hand reached across the table, slow as a sunrise, and covered hers. Rough, calloused palm against her trembling fingers. She gasped, not in surprise, in recognition, as if that single touch had erased all 10 years of pain and distance. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the storm was finally over. That night, they stepped outside together. The sky was a vast, black canvas, splashed with more stars than he'd ever seen. He led her to the edge of the ridge, the very spot where he had spent 1,000 nights talking to her, whispering her name to the wind, hoping it might find her wherever she was. He told her this place had been his church, and his grave. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt her tears, warm against his neck. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair. She whispered back, "I was never gone. Even when they dragged me away, I carried you. You were my heartbeat." The world went still. It felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. For the first time in 10 years, He didn't feel like the ghost on the ridge. He felt whole. He felt like the entire universe had conspired, spinning for a decade, just to bring her back to his side. But this wasn't an ending. He knew that now. He could feel it in the warmth of her hand in his. This was the beginning of a fire being rekindled, and this time, there was no storm in the world that could ever put it out. As they stood there, under the silent watch of the stars, she stiffened. Her head lifted from his shoulder, her eyes darting into the darkness of the valley below. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Her hand gripped his arm, her knuckles white. "They'll come," she whispered, her voice tight with a new kind of fear. "He won't just let me go." "He?" The word was a piece of gravel in his throat. He had thought her people, the tribe as a whole, had taken her. An ancient law, a faceless decision. But the way she said, "he," it was personal. "Kyle," she breathed the name like a curse. "The elder who took me. He said I belonged to the tribe, but he meant I belonged to him." A cold dread, colder than any winter night, seeped into his bones. This wasn't just about tradition. This was about a man, a cruel man. He looked at the lines on her face, the white in her hair, and suddenly he wasn't just seeing sorrow. He was seeing the work of a monster. "He forced you?" he asked, his voice shaking with a rage he hadn't felt in years. She shook her head, a small, quick movement. "No, not like that. It was worse. He made me a servant, an outcast within my own family. He said my love for an outsider had stained me. He made sure everyone saw me as worthless. He broke my spirit, day by day, year by year. He enjoyed it." The ghost on the ridge was gone. In his place stood a man ready to burn the world down. "Why now?" he demanded. "What changed, after all this time?" She finally turned to face him fully, her eyes pleading with him to understand. He found out. Found out what? Her voice dropped to a barely audible whisper, a secret she had protected for 9 long years. "They didn't just tell me you were dead, Jacob. They showed me proof. A letter from the preacher in the valley. A lock of your hair. They convinced me you'd been killed in a rockslide." His blood ran cold. The preacher, the one man who had tried to get him to move on. He'd given him a haircut just a few weeks after she was taken. He'd thought nothing of it. It was all a lie. A cruel, calculated lie to keep them apart forever. His grief hadn't been an accident. It had been an assassination of the soul. "But that's not why I ran," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I ran because Cale discovered the one secret I kept from him, the one thing that was still mine." He waited, his heart pounding. The world seemed to shrink down to the space between them, to the terrible truth hanging in the air. "When they took me from you, Jacob," she said, taking a deep, shuddering breath, "I was pregnant." The stars overhead seemed to flicker and die. The ground beneath his feet felt like it was falling away. Pregnant. A child. His child. "He's 9 years old," she whispered, and this time the tears finally fell, hot and fast, down her weathered cheeks. "His name is Caleb, and he has your eyes." The world came rushing back in a roar. A son. He had a son, a 9-year-old boy he had never known existed. A boy raised under the shadow of the man who had tormented his mother. "Where is he?" The question was ripped from his soul. "Safe, for now," she said quickly. "I hid him. Cale doesn't know where. When I heard Cale talking about purifying the tribe, about getting rid of any half-blood taint, I knew. He wasn't just talking about me anymore. He was talking about my son, our son. So I ran. I had to get to you. You're the only one who can help us." The night was no longer peaceful. It was filled with unseen hunters. The wind was no longer a whisper. It was the sound of approaching danger. His quiet, lonely ridge was no longer a sanctuary. It was the front line of a war he hadn't even known he was fighting. He looked at this woman, this warrior who had endured a decade of hell to protect their child. He looked down toward the dark valley where his son was hidden, and then he looked at his own hands, calloused from labor meant to forget. Now, that labor was over. It was time to remember how to fight. "They're coming," she had said. He pulled her close, his hand moving to the back of her head, protective. "Let them come," he growled, the words rumbling deep in his chest. For the first time in 10 years, the ghost on the ridge had a reason to live. And now, he had a reason to kill. The warmth of the cabin felt like a fantasy. Jacob moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in a decade. The quiet, grieving man was gone, stripped away layer by layer with every shocking revelation. In his place was someone harder, sharper, a predator who'd just been told his young was in danger. He didn't ask 1,000 questions. Not yet. There wasn't time. Action was the only language that made sense now. He checked the rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace. He ran an oiled cloth over the barrel, his movements precise and economical. He checked his ammunition. It was low, meant for coyotes, not men. "Where is he?" he asked again, his voice flat and steady. "A farm, down in the West Valley. The Miller family," she said, her eyes following his every move. "They're good people. They've helped me before, passed messages when they could. They don't know the whole truth, but they know Caleb is in danger." The Millers. He knew them. Quiet folk who kept to themselves. They traded with him once or twice a year. He'd never thought much of them, but now they were the lifeline to a son he'd never met. "The storm bought you time," he said, thinking aloud. "It washed away your tracks, but it's letting up. By sunrise, a good tracker could pick up your trail." "Cale has the best trackers," she confirmed, her voice grim. "They can follow a shadow across bare rock." He nodded. This wasn't a question of if they would be followed, but when. He pulled out a worn map from an old chest, spreading it on the rough-hewn table. His finger, thick and calloused, traced a path through the mountains. "The Miller's farm is too exposed," he said. "We can't stay there. We have to get the boy and move. Head east, over the pass. By the time they figure out we're not heading south, we'll have a 2-day lead." It sounded simple, but it wasn't. The pass was treacherous even in good weather. After a storm like this, it would be a nightmare of mudslides and swollen rivers, and they would have a 9-year-old boy with them. "Is there anyone else?" she asked. "Anyone in the town we can trust?" He thought of the people in the small settlement below, the blacksmith, the store owner, the preacher. His gut tightened at the thought of the preacher, the man who had helped sell the lie that had stolen his life. Who else was in on it? Who else had Cale paid off or threatened? "No," he said, his voice hard. "We trust no one, only ourselves." He packed a satchel with what little he had. Dried meat, a block of cheese, a full canteen. He handed her a heavy oilskin coat. It was too big for her, but it was dry and warm. "We leave in an hour," he said, "before the first hint of dawn. The mist will give us cover to get down the ridge." She just nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and, for the first time, a sliver of hope. She had made it. She had found him. The burden was no longer hers to carry alone. As he worked, a thought pricked at him, a detail that didn't fit. "How did you know I was still here?" he asked, stopping his work to look at her. "After 10 years, after they told you I was dead, what made you come back to this exact spot?" Her expression shifted. A flicker of something he couldn't read crossed her face. She reached into the folds of her wet dress and pulled out a small leather pouch. Her fingers, still trembling slightly, untied the drawstring. She poured the contents into her palm. It was a single, smooth, white stone. "Do you remember this?" she asked. He felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered. The day before they took her. They were by the creek. He had picked up the stone and told her it was a promise, that as long as this stone existed, his heart was hers, and he would be waiting for her on this ridge. He'd given it to her as a silly, romantic gesture, a keepsake. "I kept it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For 10 years, it was all I had of you. Even when they told me you were dead, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I held it every night. And a month ago, it started to feel warm." He stared at her, confused. "Warm? Not a real warmth," she explained, her eyes wide and earnest. "A feeling, a pull, like it was calling to me. I started dreaming of this cabin again, of you. I know it sounds crazy, but it was like the stone knew you were still alive. It's what gave me the courage to finally run. It's what led me back here." He didn't know what to say. He was a practical man. He believed in fences and cattle and the turning of the seasons. He didn't believe in magic stones. But he was looking at a woman who had crossed a storm-swept wilderness, guided by a rock and a desperate hope, and found him. What else could it be? Before he could answer, a sound from outside cut through the night. The howl of the wind had died down, replaced by an eerie quiet. But this was a new sound, the faint, distant nicker of a horse. They both froze, their eyes locking in shared panic. It was too soon. The storm had barely passed. The trackers couldn't be here already, unless they hadn't been tracking her at all. What if they hadn't followed her from the tribe's land? What if they were already here, waiting? He grabbed his rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He moved to the window, peering through a tiny crack in the shutter. The moon had broken through the clouds, bathing the ridge in a pale, silvery light. And there, at the edge of the tree line, he saw them. 2 riders, sitting perfectly still on their horses, their shapes dark silhouettes against the moonlit forest. They weren't looking for a trail. They were watching the cabin. They had known. They had known she would come here. His entire plan, the escape through the pass, the 2-day lead, it all evaporated into smoke. They weren't chasing them. They were herding them. And his cabin on the ridge wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. His mind raced, discarding one impossible plan after another. There were 2 of them out there, maybe more hidden in the trees. He had 1 rifle and a handful of cartridges. Attacking was suicide. Staying was a death sentence. "There's a back way," he whispered, his voice urgent, never taking his eyes off the riders. "An old game trail. It's steep, dangerous, but it leads down the far side of the ridge. They won't be expecting it." He turned to her. The hope that had flickered in her eyes just moments before was gone, replaced by the familiar terror. "We have to go. Now," he said. "Leave everything." She just nodded, her body tense. She shoved the white stone back into her pouch, a desperate protective gesture. He crept to the back door of the cabin, a door he hadn't used in years. It was barred by a heavy plank of wood. He lifted it slowly, carefully, praying the old hinges wouldn't groan. The slightest sound could give them away. The wood scraped against the frame with a sound like a dying breath. They both froze, listening. Outside, there was only the dripping of water from the pines and the faint chirping of night insects. The riders hadn't moved. They hadn't heard. He eased the door open just enough to slip through. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. He motioned for her to follow. She moved silently behind him, a shadow at his heels. He closed the door as gently as he could, plunging them into the near-total darkness at the back of the cabin. The game trail was little more than a whisper of a path, cutting through thick underbrush. He took the lead, pushing branches aside, his feet finding their way on the slick, muddy ground from pure memory. Every snapped twig, every dislodged rock sounded like a gunshot in the silent night. He could feel her right behind him, her breathing shallow and quick. He risked a glance back at her. Her face was a pale oval in the dark, her eyes huge with fear. They were halfway down the steepest part of the trail when they heard it. A shout from the top of the ridge. They'd been spotted. The shout was followed by another, and then the thunder of horse hooves. They were coming around the side of the mountain. They were trying to cut them off. "Run!" he hissed, grabbing her hand and pulling her along. The trail was no longer a path. It was a treacherous slide of mud and rock. They stumbled. They fell. They got back up, their clothes tearing, their skin scraping against sharp branches. The sounds of their pursuers were getting closer, the crashing of their horses echoing through the trees. They burst out of the woods at the bottom of the ridge and onto a flat clearing. They were exposed. In the moonlight, they were perfect targets. Across the clearing, maybe 200 yards away, was the darkness of the next stretch of forest. If they could make it there, they might have a chance. They ran. Their lungs burned. Their legs screamed in protest. The sound of the horses was deafening now, right behind them. He could hear the men yelling in a language he didn't understand. He risked a look over his shoulder. They were closing fast. 2 riders, their faces grim in the moonlight, urging their horses on. They weren't carrying rifles. They had ropes. They didn't want to kill them. They wanted to capture them. The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. They were 50 yards from the trees, then 40, 30. He could feel the ground vibrating from the pounding hooves. He could hear the heavy breathing of the animals. They were not going to make it. Just as the first rider was nearly upon them, a shape exploded from the trees in front of them. A massive dark form moving with impossible speed. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It was a horse, but bigger than any horse he had ever seen, and it was charging not at them, but at their pursuers. On its back was a rider, a small figure wrapped in dark cloth. The lead pursuer's horse reared in terror, screaming as the charging animal slammed into its side. The rider was thrown, landing with a sickening thud. The second rider pulled his horse up short, his face a mask of disbelief. The mysterious rider brought their giant horse to a halt between Jacob and the remaining pursuer. The figure turned, and in the moonlight he saw a face. It was the face of a boy of about 9. His expression was one of fierce concentration, his eyes burning with a fire that Jacob recognized instantly. They were his eyes. The boy looked at him, then at the woman beside him. A single word left his lips, a word that was both a question and a declaration. "Mother?" It was Caleb, his son. The world stopped spinning. Jacob stood, frozen, mud-caked and breathless, staring at the impossible reality in front of him. His son. Not hidden away on a farm, but here, in the heart of the danger, riding a beast of a horse like he was born to it. The remaining pursuer, recovering from his shock, let out a furious yell and spurred his horse forward, his rope uncoiling, ready to fly. But Caleb was faster. He pulled a small, dark object from his belt. It wasn't a gun. It was a sling. With a motion too quick to follow, he whirled it once over his head and let fly. A stone, little more than a pebble, shot through the air with a deadly hiss. It struck the pursuer's horse square on the flank. The animal shrieked in pain and bucked violently, unseating its rider. The man hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. Caleb didn't even watch him fall. He guided his horse over to them, his eyes locked on his mother's face. "I knew you would come for him," the boy said, his voice clear and steady, without a trace of fear. "The stone told me." He opened his hand. In his small palm was a white stone, identical to the one his mother carried. Jacob's mind reeled. 2 stones. Magic. A son who fought like a seasoned warrior. Nothing made sense, but they were alive, and they were together. That was all that mattered. "We have to go," the boy urged, his gaze flicking back toward the 2 downed men. "The others will have heard the commotion. They will be here soon." He was right. This was just the advance party. Cale himself, with the rest of his trackers, wouldn't be far behind. The boy offered his mother a hand, pulling her up onto the massive horse behind him with surprising strength. Jacob, his heart still hammering, scrambled up after her. The horse was immense, easily carrying the 3 of them. "Hold on," Caleb said. And with a quiet word, He urged the horse into the trees, not back toward the valley, but deeper into the uncharted wilderness, away from any known trail. As they rode, the questions swirled in Jacob's head. How did the boy know where they were? What was the story of the second stone? How did a 9-year-old learn to fight and ride with such skill? He looked at the small, straight back of his son, a boy he had never known who had just saved his life. And he looked at the woman clinging to him, her face buried in the boy's shoulder, weeping silent tears of shock and relief. The reunion he had dreamed of was nothing like this. It was supposed to be quiet, a rekindling. Instead, it was a desperate flight through the dark, with an unknown number of enemies on their trail and a son who was a complete and utter mystery. The last 10 years of his life had been a lie. He was beginning to wonder if the next 10 minutes would be the end of it. They rode hard for what felt like hours, the massive horse moving through the dense, dark forest with an unnatural certainty. Caleb didn't seem to need a trail. He navigated by instinct, by the stars that peeked through the canopy, by some internal compass Jacob couldn't begin to understand. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the trees, the boy brought them to a halt. They were in a small, hidden dell, a tiny pocket of flat ground, surrounded by a sheer rock wall on one side and a thicket of ancient, tangled trees on the other. A small spring bubbled up from the ground, providing fresh water. It was a perfect hiding place. Caleb slid from the horse's back with the easy grace of someone who had spent their whole life in a saddle. Jacob and the boy's mother, whose name he still hadn't dared to say out loud, followed more clumsily, their bodies aching and stiff. For a moment, they just stood there in the quiet morning light, a strange, broken family reunited in the most impossible of circumstances. Caleb looked from his mother's face to Jacob's, his expression serious, analytical. He was studying them. "The Millers were taken," Caleb said, his voice losing some of its battlefield confidence, now sounding more like the 9-year-old boy he was. "Cale's men came yesterday evening. They knew I was there. I was out checking traps when I saw them ride up. I hid. I watched them take Mr. and Mrs. Miller. They were asking about you," he said, looking at his mother, "and about the man on the ridge." A fresh wave of guilt washed over Jacob. The Millers, innocent people, were now in the hands of a monster because of him, because of his connection to this woman and a child he didn't know existed. His gaze fell back to his son. "The stone," Jacob said, his voice rough. "Your mother has one. Where did you get yours?" Caleb reached into his pouch and pulled out the smooth white rock. "She gave it to me when I was very small," he explained. "She said it was a piece of my father's heart. She told me to keep it safe, always. That as long as I had it, he wasn't truly gone. When she left to find you, my stone got warm. It told me she was in danger. It showed me the way." Jacob looked at the woman. Her name was Ilara. He finally let himself think it. Ilara. Her face was filled with a fierce, protective pride as she watched their son. "He has a gift, Jacob," she said softly. "The women in my family, some of them can feel things, connections, echoes, the stones. They aren't magic. They are just a focus, a piece of the mountain that connects us. When you gave me that stone, you gave me a piece of your spirit, tied to this land. Caleb inherited that connection. He is more tied to this place than any of us." It was too much to take in. Spirits, connections, a gifted son. He was a simple man who knew cattle and fences, but the proof was right in front of him, a boy who had appeared out of nowhere and saved them. "Cale knows about his gift," Ilara continued, her voice dropping, filled with dread. "That's the real reason he wants him. He doesn't just want to eliminate a half-blood. He wants to use him. A boy who can feel the land, who can track anything. He would be the perfect weapon." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more terrible than he could have imagined. Kyle wasn't just cruel. He was ambitious. He wanted to twist his son's gift into something dark. So the farm was a trap, Jacob realized aloud. Cale knew you'd go there for Caleb. He let you. And he knew you'd come to me next. He was tightening the net. He underestimated him, Alara said, putting a hand on Caleb's shoulder. We can't rest long, Caleb said, his focus returning. They will find the trail of my horse. It is too big to hide easily. And they have the millers. They will force them to talk. Jacob's mind was working again, the shock giving way to cold, hard strategy. The pass is no good. They'll expect us to run for it. They'll have it covered. He looked at the rock wall that sheltered their hiding spot. What's on the other side of this? He asked Caleb. The dead woods, the boy answered immediately. The old people say it's haunted, a whole section of forest where the trees are petrified, turned to stone. No one goes there, not even Cale's trackers. Jacob looked from the boy to Alara. A desperate, insane idea was forming in his mind. It was a gamble that could get them all killed, but it was better than waiting to be caught. We go through the dead woods, Jacob declared. They'll follow our trail to this point. When it vanishes at this rock wall, they'll think we're trying to climb it. It'll buy us time while they search. They'll never believe we went into the one place they fear. Alara looked uncertain. The stories say that spirits of the mountain guard that place, that men who enter never come out. We have a guide who can feel the mountain's spirit, Jacob said, looking directly at Caleb. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't look scared. He looked at the rock wall, a strange look of concentration on his face. He closed his eyes. There's a way, Caleb said after a moment, his eyes snapping open. Not a path, a crack, a passage. It's tight, and it's dark, but it goes through to the other side. Jacob nodded. Then that's our route. As they prepared to move, gathering what little they had, a new sound reached them. It was faint, carried on the morning breeze, the sound of a dog barking, a hunting dog. Cale wasn't just using trackers anymore. He had brought dogs. Their time had just run out. Now, Jacob commanded. We go now. Caleb led them to a part of the rock face that looked solid, covered in moss and vines. But when he pulled the greenery aside, a narrow, dark fissure was revealed. It was barely wide enough for a man to fit through sideways. The horse will have to be left, Caleb said, a note of sadness in his voice as he patted the giant animal's neck. He can find his own way. He's not just a horse, is he? Jacob asked, looking at the creature that seemed to understand every word. He is a friend, Caleb replied simply. Alara went first, squeezing into the dark crack in the rock. Caleb followed. Jacob took one last look back the way they had come. He could hear the dogs more clearly now, their bays echoing through the forest. He turned and plunged into the darkness of the mountain, the rock scraping against his shoulders. The passage was a claustrophobic nightmare. It was utterly black, cold, and damp. They moved in a line, Jacob's hand on Caleb's shoulder, Caleb's hand on his mother's. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the dripping of water somewhere in the deep earth. Time ceased to have meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. The air grew stale and thin. Jacob's initial burst of adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. He was running on 10 years of grief and a few hours of terror. Just when he thought the walls were closing in for good, he saw a faint gray light ahead. The passage was opening up. They stumbled out of the crack and into a world unlike anything he had ever seen. They were in the dead woods. It was a forest of stone. The trees were ancient and massive, but their bark was gray, hard, and cold to the touch. There were no leaves, no needles, no life. The ground was a carpet of shattered rock. The air was still and silent. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The silence was absolute, heavier and more terrifying than the darkness of the tunnel. Even the light was strange, a diffuse gray glow that seemed to come from nowhere, and cast no shadows. "The spirits. I can feel them," Alara whispered, her arms wrapped around herself. "They are not angry. They are waiting." Caleb stood, his head cocked, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. "They know we are here," he said. "They are watching." Jacob scanned their surroundings. The stone forest stretched out in every direction. There were no landmarks, no sun to guide them. It would be easy to get lost, to walk in circles until you starved. "Which way, son?" Jacob asked, his voice sounding loud and harsh in the oppressive silence. Caleb closed his eyes again, his face a mask of concentration. He stood like that for a full minute. Jacob felt a prickle of fear. What if the boy's gift didn't work here? What if the spirits Alara mentioned were hostile? Then Caleb's eyes opened. He pointed to the north. "That way. There is a heart, a center. The spirits want us to go there. They say it is the only safe place." Jacob didn't question him. He trusted the boy's strange certainty more than he trusted his own eyes in this disorienting landscape. They started walking, their footsteps crunching loudly on the rocky ground. The stone trees seemed to watch them pass. Their gnarled, petrified branches looked like skeletal arms reaching for them. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Jacob kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see Cale and his men, but there was nothing. Only the endless, silent, gray forest. After an hour of walking, they saw something that didn't belong, a splash of color in the monochrome world. It was a piece of red cloth tied to the branch of a stone tree. Caleb stopped, his body going tense. "What is it?" Alara asked. "A ward," Caleb whispered. "From the tribe. To keep things in, or to keep people out." Jacob walked closer. He recognized the symbols painted on the cloth in black. They were tribal markings. He'd seen them before, on the horses of the men who had taken Alara away. And then he saw another one, 100 yards away, and another. They weren't lost. They were following a trail of wards left by the tribe, leading deeper into the heart of the dead woods. "This isn't a haunted forest," Jacob said, the terrible realization dawning on him. "It's a prison." Before anyone could react, the ground began to tremble. A low rumbling sound echoed through the stone trees, growing louder and louder. It wasn't an earthquake. It was coming from one direction. It was the sound of something immense, something heavy, moving through the petrified forest. And it was moving toward them. The rumbling grew into a thunderous roar that shook the very ground they stood on. The sound was all around them, echoing off the stone trees, making it impossible to tell which direction it was coming from. Dust and rock chips rained down from the petrified branches above. "What is that?" Alara cried out, her hands covering her ears. Caleb stood his ground, his eyes wide, but not with fear, with awe. "The Guardian," he breathed. "They've woken the Guardian." Through the gray, hazy light, a shape began to emerge from between the stone trees. It was massive, bigger than a house, a hulking silhouette of rock and earth. It moved slowly, ponderously, each step a tremor. It wasn't alive in the way a bear or a cougar was alive. It looked like the mountain itself had risen up and taken form. It was a golem, a creature of legend, a spirit of the earth given physical shape. Its body was a chaotic mass of granite and obsidian, with ancient, petrified trees growing from its back like spines. It had no face, only two glowing points of light, deep within its rocky head, that burned like coals. Jacob had heard the old stories, the tribal legends that the valley folk dismissed as superstition. He had never believed them, not for a second. But the proof was right in front of him, a walking nightmare of stone and magic, and it was blocking their path. The creature came to a halt about 50 yards from them, its glowing eyes fixing on them. The silence that returned was even more terrifying than the noise had been. "It guards the heart of the woods," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the terrifying sight. It keeps prisoners from escaping. So the stories are true, Ilara whispered in horror. The dead woods aren't just a place people get lost. The tribe brings its worst enemies here and leaves them for this thing. Jacob's mind was reeling. Cale hadn't been chasing them to capture them. He had been herding them, driving them right into this trap. He didn't need to risk a fight. He just needed to get them into the dead woods, and the Guardian would do the rest. It was the perfect execution. The golem took another step forward, the ground shaking. It raised a massive arm, a limb made of petrified logs and jagged rock. Jacob shoved Ilara and Caleb behind him, raising his rifle. The weapon felt like a child's toy against this monster. A bullet would do nothing but chip its stone hide. But it was all he had. "Don't!" Caleb shouted, grabbing his arm. "You can't fight it. It's part of the mountain. Hurting it would be like hurting the mountain itself." "What do you suggest we do, son? Let it crush us?" Jacob snapped, his fear turning to anger. "It's not angry," Caleb said, his eyes still locked on the creature. "It's confused. It feels the ward stones, the prison, but it also feels us. It feels the stones we carry. It's a part of the same mountain. It recognizes a piece of itself." The golem paused, its glowing eyes seeming to narrow, focusing on the small family huddled before it. It tilted its massive head, a gesture of curiosity. "Talk to it," Jacob urged the boy, his desperation growing. "If you can feel the mountain, maybe you can speak to it." Caleb shook his head. "I can't speak to it. Not with words, but maybe—" The boy stepped out from behind Jacob, a small, fragile figure in front of the colossal stone monster. Ilara gasped, reaching for him, but Jacob held her back. He didn't understand what was happening, but he saw the look on his son's face. It was the same look of fierce concentration he'd had when he faced the trackers. He was trusting the boy. He had to. Caleb held out his hand, his palm open. In it lay the smooth, white promise stone. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a silent offering to the ancient creature. The golem was utterly still. Its burning eyes seemed to focus on the tiny stone in the boy's hand. The silence stretched for an eternity. Jacob could hear his own blood pounding in his ears. Then, the golem moved. It slowly lowered its massive stone arm, the sound of grinding rock filling the air. Its hand, a collection of boulders the size of barrels, came to rest on the ground in front of Caleb, the impact making the ground jump. Slowly, carefully, one of its fingers, a jagged shard of obsidian taller than the boy, extended. It touched the white stone in Caleb's palm. The moment the two stones made contact, a low hum filled the air. A soft blue light emanated from the point of contact, pulsing gently. The glowing red eyes of the golem flickered, and the fierce red light softened to the same gentle blue. The Guardian was not a monster. It was a warden, and it had just recognized that they were not prisoners. The golem slowly retracted its hand. It turned its massive body and took a step to the side, clearing the path forward. It then stood perfectly still, like a statue, its blue eyes watching them, no longer a threat, but a silent sentinel. Jacob let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for 10 years. "The heart of the woods," Caleb said, his voice quiet. "It's letting us pass. It wants us to go there." They walked past the silent golem, moving deeper into the petrified forest. The feeling of being watched was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't menacing. It felt protective. The trail of red ward cloths continued, leading them on. After another mile, the stone trees began to thin, opening into a large, circular clearing. And in the center of the clearing was something that made Jacob's blood run cold. It was a cage, a massive cage, woven from the petrified branches of the dead trees, forming a crude but inescapable prison. And inside the cage were people. the millers, the kind, simple farmers who had tried to help them. They were huddled together, their faces bruised and stained with fear. But they were not alone. Standing in front of the cage, his back to them, was a tall man, draped in dark furs. Even from behind, Jacob could feel the arrogance and cruelty radiating from him. The man turned slowly, as if he had been expecting them all along. His face was sharp and angular, his eyes black and merciless. A cruel smirk played on his lips. It was Cale, and standing next to him, held tightly by two of his warriors, was the preacher from the valley. "So, the ghost of the ridge finally comes down from his mountain," Cale said, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone. "I must admit I am impressed. No one has ever made it past the Guardian before." He gestured to Caleb. "But then, no one has ever had such a key, have they? You see, Jacob, your son is destined for great things. He will be my tracker, my weapon. He will help me cleanse this land of all who are unworthy." "You'll never have him," Jacob snarled, raising his rifle. Kyle just laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "You are in no position to make demands. You are in my prison now. This entire forest is my domain. You have nowhere to run." As he spoke, more of his warriors melted out from between the stone trees, surrounding the clearing. They were outnumbered at least 10-1. They had been fools. The Guardian hadn't been letting them pass to safety. It had been delivering them right into the executioner's hands. Caleb's gift, the promise stones, the Guardian. It had all been part of Cale's intricate, horrifying plan. "It wasn't a trap for you," Cale said, his eyes glittering with triumph as he looked at Jacob. "It was a test. For him." He pointed a long, cruel finger at Caleb, "and he has passed magnificently." The game was over. They had lost. Kyle had outmaneuvered them at every turn. "Now," Cale said, his smirk widening, "give me the boy, and I will grant his mother a quick death. As for you, Ghost, you can have your precious solitude once more. I will return you to your ridge, where you can live out your pathetic life, haunted by the knowledge that you let your son become my monster." This was the choice: his life of empty peace, or the soul of his son. Jacob looked at Ilara, her face a mask of defiant hatred. He looked at Caleb, who stared back at Cale not with fear, but with a cold fury that mirrored his own. He lowered his rifle. He had spent 10 years as a ghost. 10 years running from a fight he thought he'd already lost. He was done running. He looked Cale dead in the eye. "No," he said, his voice quiet, but filled with the weight of a decade of silenced rage. Kyle's smile faltered. "A foolish choice." He gestured to his men. "Kill him." But before the warriors could move, Caleb stepped forward. He held his white stone up high. "You are wrong," the boy's voice rang out, clear and powerful, echoing in the dead silence of the clearing. "This is not your domain. This is the mountain's domain, and you are not welcome here." Caleb closed his eyes, and the stone in his hand began to glow, not with the soft blue light from before, but with a brilliant, blinding white light. The ground began to shake again, but this time it wasn't just the Guardian. All around them, the stone trees began to vibrate, a low, deep hum that grew and grew until it was a deafening roar. The petrified branches, the skeletal arms, began to twist and writhe. The dead woods were waking up. Cale and his men stared in disbelief and terror as the forest came to life around them. The Guardian, the silent sentinel at the edge of the clearing, took a thunderous step forward, its eyes now glowing with a furious white-hot intensity. This wasn't Cale's prison anymore. It was his tomb. The white light from Caleb's stone exploded outwards, a shockwave of pure energy. It didn't harm Jacob or Ilara, but it slammed into Cale's warriors like a physical blow, throwing them from their feet. The Guardian strode into the clearing, its massive form eclipsing the gray sky. It didn't attack the men. It went for the cage. With one swipe of its colossal arm, it shattered the petrified bars, freeing the millers. Cale stared, his arrogance finally cracking, revealing the panicked tyrant beneath. He had sought to control the power of the mountain, but he had never truly understood it. He saw Caleb not as a child of the mountain, but as a tool, and the mountain was now passing its judgment. "This is not possible!" Kyle shrieked, drawing a wicked-looking knife from his belt. His men were in disarray, terrified of the living forest around them. He lunged, not at Jacob, but at Caleb. If he couldn't have the boy, he would destroy him. Jacob was faster. He had spent 10 years honing his body with mindless labor, building a strength born of grief. He met Cale's charge, his rifle butt swinging in a vicious arc, crashing into Cale's jaw with a sickening crack. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The rest of his warriors, seeing their leader fall and with the ancient guardian looming over them, threw down their weapons and fell to their knees. The fight was over. The rumbling of the forest subsided. The stone trees grew still once more. The brilliant light from Caleb's stone faded, and the boy swayed on his feet, the effort of what he had done clearly draining him. Alara rushed to his side, holding him close. Jacob looked at the scene around him, at the captured warriors, the freed millers, the terrified preacher cowering in a corner. He looked at the massive, silent guardian, its eyes now a soft, peaceful blue again, and he looked at his family, his son, who held the power of the earth in his small hand, his wife, who had endured a decade of torment and never broken. He walked over to where Cale lay and pulled the man's knife from his limp hand. He then went to the preacher, whose face was ashen with guilt and fear. "You," Jacob said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You helped him. You wrote that letter. You helped him steal 10 years of my life." "He made me," the preacher stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "He threatened my family. I had no choice." Jacob looked at the knife in his hand, then at the pathetic, trembling man before him. For 10 years, he had dreamed of vengeance against the faceless people who had taken Alara. Now, here was one of them. A part of him, the ghost, wanted to see him pay. But when he looked back at Alara and Caleb, he saw no hatred in their eyes, only exhaustion and a profound sense of peace. He was not a ghost anymore. He was a husband and a father. Vengeance was the language of ghosts. He tossed the knife to the ground. "Get out of my sight," he growled. "Go back to your valley and tell them what happened here. Tell them the truth." The preacher scrambled to his feet and fled, stumbling through the stone trees, a man running from his own damnation. Jacob walked back to Alara and Caleb. He knelt down in front of his son, putting a hand on his shoulder. The boy looked up at him, his eyes, so like his own, filled with questions. "I don't understand all this," Jacob said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in a lifetime. "The stones, the guardian, your gift. But I understand one thing." He pulled the boy into a hug, a real hug, holding his son for the first time. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved us." He then looked at Alara, over the top of their son's head. Her eyes were shining with tears, but for the first time, they were tears of joy. He reached out his other hand, and she took it, her fingers lacing with his. They were a family, battered, broken, and brought together by a storm of lies and magic. But they were whole. The guardian watched them for a long moment, then turned and lumbered back into the stone forest, its duty done. The millers, safe and sound, were weeping with relief. The captured warriors waited for their judgment. The sun finally broke through the perpetual gray haze of the dead woods, a real sun, casting long, warm shadows for the first time. It was over. The long night was finally over. They walked out of that forest, not as fugitives, but as survivors. They left Cale and his men for the tribe to deal with. Their justice would be far more fitting than his. They rode out of the valley a few days later, the millers waving them a tearful goodbye. They didn't look back. There was nothing for them there but ghosts and bad memories. They found a new piece of land, far to the east, a place with rolling green hills and a creek that sang a cheerful song. Jacob built a new cabin, bigger than the old one. Ilara planted a garden, and the color slowly began to return to her hair, not the black it had once been, but a beautiful silver, a testament to her strength, not her sorrow. Caleb explored the new land, his connection to it just as strong, but now it was a joyful thing, not a weapon. He would come home with stories of what the river had told him or what the hawks had seen from above. Jacob started talking again. First, just a few words, then stories. Then, one day, Ilara heard him down by the creek, trying to sing. His voice was still cracked and rough, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. He wasn't the ghost on the ridge anymore. He was just Jacob, a husband, a father, a man who had been buried alive and had clawed his way back into the sun. Sometimes at night, he would hold the smooth white stone in his hand and think about the impossible journey that had brought his family back to him. Love wasn't a wound you could walk off. He'd been wrong about that. Love was a promise, a connection, a piece of the mountain itself. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it's a kind of magic strong enough to bring the dead back to life. What do you think? Was it fate that brought them back together, or was it the courage to never give up hope? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because you never know what strange and mysterious tales are waiting just over the next ridge.